Well, good morning again. Thanks for joining us again. We apologize. We were having some technical issues a little while ago, but we are back with you, and I'm here again with GBMC nurses Judy Bosley and Pamela Nichols from the Sandra and Malcolm Berman Cancer Institute over at GBMC. And today we're talking about clinical trials for cancer patients. It's a great topic. We want you to be involved in it, so feel free to interact with us. I'm going to be on my phone. When you see me looking down, I'll take your questions and I'll ask the experts. So we want to make this, again, really interactive. So join us, join in on Facebook Live now. And I want to thank you, too, for being with us and hanging with us through some technical difficulties we had, but we're back.
Well, thanks for having us.
Of course, it's a great topic, and I think a lot of people have questions about it. Cancer touches everyone in some way. Everyone knows somebody, maybe in family or friends that has it. And so I think it's a great topic just to get out there, that there are a lot of clinical trials out there for people to look into. We had some questions that were submitted before, so let's start with the first one. When we talk about protocol, what is a protocol for a clinical trial?
So the protocol is the actual plan or the guideline for the clinical trial. It's what we will use to guide our patients' therapy while they're participating in the trial. And it gives us, it's kind of like a cookbook where it gives us all the answers on how we're going to manage side effects, or how we're going to change dosage of treatment because they're having certain side effects. Mm-hmm. And it's meant to, these things are in place to keep the patient safe and for us to get the answers that we need from the research.
When people come in, do you feel like people are really curious about clinical trials? Do you think people are anxious to explore it? Or do you think people are a little more hesitant because it's scary? You don't know a whole lot about the treatment that's being studied.
I think with the age of the internet now, patients are much more informed about trials. Still, participation in clinical trials is 2 to 3% of patients participate, but doctors are the key. They're the ones who they're the gatekeepers. They open the gate to trials for patients. They introduce, they say, you may be appropriate for a trial that we have, and then they'll refer them over to the clinical trials department.
Another question we had that came in asks, at what point during treatment can a patient join a clinical trial? Can they do it right away? Do they have to wait a little bit into their treatment?
Well, I would encourage patients, before their first visit with their physician, is to really do some research and to look into clinical trials. And I know at GBMC we encourage from the very beginning we look at trials from the very first treatment all the way through till the last treatment that we consider clinical trials.
When we hear an informed consent, what does that mean to us? What is an informed consent?
The informed consent informs the patient about everything that occurs during the trial. It discusses who's sponsoring the trial. It discusses the benefits, the risk, the drugs involved, the treatment plan. It discusses the HIPAA, the Privacy Act, because everything is kept confidential in trials with patients' names, addresses, and they don't. Studies do not refer to patients' names or addresses or things like that. If you wanted to add anything about the consent, I mean, it's a big process.
It's a process, and it's an ongoing process because we learn new information as the clinical trial is going on. So we are constantly informing patients of new information throughout their participation in the trial. So if new side effects arise, we have to inform the patient. If new results from the study come about, then we take the time and we inform the patient about that.
So it sounds like a patient is never left in the dark about anything that
Correct.
You guys communicate.
Right. No.
Yeah, extremely well. Okay, we had a question here on Facebook. Does insurance pay for trials? And if not, are there costs passed on to the patient? And I know that's a big question. You say you get a lot from patients.
That's a great question, and it comes up just about 100% of the time. And typically, the studies, everything that is in a study is considered standard of care, and the insurance company will pay for all of that. Those items that are considered outside of the gold standard, of what maybe is extra, then the sponsors for the clinical trial have means to pay for that, and it will not cost the patient extra.
And examples of that could be like the cost of the experimental drug on a study, any like tests that are above and beyond the standard, like a scan, extra lab work. The clinical trial may would probably cover the cost of that for the patients. But we have seen that insurance companies don't give patients problems with
really?
Yeah.
That's good to know. Yeah.
pills.
I know some people wrote in asking too, can patients get compensated for being part of a clinical trial?
Well, there are some trials that do compensate patients. Most of our oncology trials, if we do provide any compensation, it's usually the study sponsor will provide some money for their time and travel. Something that might help because they're seeing they might be taking an extra visit, might help cover the cost of parking, gas, but they're not necessarily being paid to participate in the treatment, but just a little something to help with the extra that they might have to put.
When we went live a few minutes ago, I wanted to ask that same question because I thought it was good. Someone asked if they saw a clinical trial at GBMC and they wanted to be involved, can they just go and will they get in? And if they are denied, how does that work? Can you ask, again, to be a part of it?
Right. So, part of, going into a clinical trial, there's something called eligibility criteria. And eligibility criteria are a set of guidelines that we look at to see if they fit the participation in the trial. And they're really set for the safety of the patient. And so if they don't meet those criteria, there are instances where we can contact the sponsor and, like an appeal, like they just said, can we throw out an appeal there? And we have done that in the past. Sometimes the answer is yes, sometimes the answer is no. But the ability to do that is there.
I'm not sure if this has ever happened, but I mean, is there at any point the patient says, I don't want to continue with this at all? I mean, is there some sort of contract they're in with you guys, or can they just say, I don't want to do it anymore, and they're done?
At any time, a patient can withdraw from a trial. A physician, if they feel that it's in the best interest that a patient withdraw from study treatment, they can come off the study treatment. But we follow patients for years usually on a trial, even after they're finished their treatment, because we want to see the efficacy of the drug and see how they long-term effects, and we watch for long-term side effects too when we follow patients out. So even though they may have done, let's say, half of their treatment,
right,
they would come off the study treatment, but we would still continue to follow them.
So it's interesting you say you follow them for years after, and so somebody wrote in, what is the time commitment for a clinical trial? It sounds like it could be a while.
It could be, and it varies per trial. There are some trials that, the treatment is only a few months and the follow-up is only a few months. Majority of our treatment trials, the treatment portion may only be 6 months, but we continue to follow the patients for up to 5 to 10 years.
Okay. Lisa Ann just wrote in, will the clinical trial involve hospitalization? Just wondering.
It's a good question, Lisa Ann. Most of our trials do not require hospitalization. Patients, most chemotherapy regimens now are given in the outpatient infusion center. So, or a lot of our chemotherapy drugs are turning into oral drugs now. Drug companies are finding easier access for patients to administer, easier ways to administer chemotherapy to patients in an oral form where they'll be taking them at home on their own. And we do monitor patients very well with patient diaries, and we make sure that they take them correctly because they're not getting it in the infusion center. But the answer to the question about hospitalization, it's very rare, very rare.
It sounds like, the patient really has to be committed to this too, because if they're doing patient diaries and they have to be, talking to you guys when they come in about their experience, right? So it sounds like it is a commitment.
It is. It is. It's a commitment, on the patient's part and on the provider and, the nurse's part. We develop very strong relationships with our patients, and we probably on sometimes a daily and sometimes a weekly basis have contact with our patients.
Really? Yeah.
And the majority of the patients, it's a positive relationship with. They feel as though they have someone close to call. They don't have to call the doctor and ask the doctor to call him back. They have direct access to the research nurses and the research team, so we can get their questions answered quickly, and because they have to be, because we're following them on the studies.
Well, if you're just joining us, we are talking to GBMC nurses about clinical trials for cancer patients. Tune in on Facebook Live. Ask any question you have. These are the experts, and this is the time to ask those questions. Another question that came in, if a patient becomes ill as a result of the trial, what's the process for seeking treatment for that illness?
So, I mean, the treatment would be, we would provide treatment for the patient, if they did become ill while they were on a clinical trial, and it would be through the physician that is caring for them. And it explains that in the informed consent too. We go through that if you have become ill while you're on this clinical trial and we feel that it is due to the clinical trial, then we will provide medical care for that.
You have to give people who do clinical trials so much credit too, because they are really helping to advance.
Oh, absolutely.
The medicines that we have, the treatments that we have for other people,
Right.
So is that what you say to them? I'm sure you say that to them,
Right.
that they're doing, they're helping other people in the future.
And that's one of the benefits that we tell them, that you are helping advance
science.
treatment.
Yep.
And without somebody who was before you who was on a clinical trial, we wouldn't have the treatment that you are getting now. And now we're looking to see if we can improve that treatment. Right. And that's how we help each other.
Talk about some of the different phases. There are different phases of clinical trials. And at GBMC, usually don't do phase 1. So people will come in, and a lot of times these drugs have been tested before. Correct?
Correct. So phase 1 studies are your first studies that are just in humans. So they're just out of preclinical, out of the lab, as most people might think of it. And they are in a small number of patients, usually about 15 to 50 patients. And the whole goal and the whole purpose of phase 1 is to look at safety and to also look at finding the correct dose of a drug.
And then phase 2, we advanced to a bigger number of patients, and we're still looking at the safety profile of the drug there. You may have 100 to 300 patients in the phase 2 studies.
We're looking to see if it's effective on a particular type of cancer.
Okay.
So now we're looking more at efficacy and safety, but in a larger group.
Gotcha.
And then once we move to phase 3, we're then comparing it to what we consider the standard treatment. So if you were to walk into your physician's office and he was going to offer you a treatment for your cancer, we're now going to, in this clinical trial, we're going to compare a treatment to that treatment.
Gotcha.
So
another question came in. Great question, Greg. Is there an age criteria for clinical trials?
With the adult trials, the normal number is you have to be at least 18 years of age. Now, there's pediatric trials that we don't handle, Judy and I don't handle, that in the pediatric departments, patients would go on a pediatric trial, but no, 18 is usually the age. And usually the top end, there's no top end.
Okay. Sometimes we hear the word placebo floated around when we talk of clinical trials. So what is a placebo, and what are the chances a patient may get a placebo in a trial?
In cancer trials, we don't use too much placebo. I mean, a placebo is a substance that has no active ingredient in it. So in cancer trials, it would be unethical to give a patient a drug that isn't going to work. So where we see placebos in cancer trials, patients get at least the standard of care. They're getting at least what's the normal treatment for that cancer. You may have patients getting the standard treatment, and then you have 50% of the patients getting the standard treatment with a placebo, a new drug that they're testing to see how good, if it's better than just the standard. And that's where we have placebos.
yeah, no, it just would be in addition to the standard therapy. So we're trying to find out if we add an additional drug, is it better? And so you wouldn't be, the only other scenario where you would have a potential placebo is if the standard of care would be observation, where maybe, we would just really watch your cancer and see how you're doing, and then we might decide, well, maybe if we give this drug, maybe, your time to recurrence will be, longer.
Right.
So.
Yeah, we had another good question come in. If I found that there was a clinical trial available at another institution, can GBMC still access that trial information for me and provide me all the information I would need to become a patient in that clinical trial?
We would have to, in order for trials to be active at GBMC, they have to go through a review board. GBMC has its own investigational review board, and they approve studies. There's two different ways studies are brought to us. One is industry studies, such as a pharmaceutical company. Another one is government trials. The government trials we have access to. So if it's a trial that is a government-funded sponsored trial, we could open within a week or two at our site. So if a patient comes to us and wants to do one of those trials, they do have access. Pharmaceutical, they may have to go to the institution that has that study.
Gotcha. Okay, we have another question coming in on Facebook. What are the timelines for trials? If, for instance, a patient is responding well to a trial, will they be able to continue the treatment even if that trial's timeline has officially ended?
That's a good question. That is a good question. So, the clinical, like I talked about, the protocol is the guideline for the trial, and often there are set, depending on the stage of the cancer that we're treating, there are a set number of treatments that the patient is going to receive, and if that's the set number in the protocol, then that's the set number that they're going to receive.
So you won't necessarily be able to continue past
Correct.
what the clinical trial specifies.
In some instances, when patients have a more advanced cancer, they'll stay on the study drugs or the standard drugs until their disease says, hey, it's time that we do a change. So indefinitely, yeah, I mean, there are some instances where patients stay on treatment for longevity until either they're no longer tolerating the drug or until maybe it's time for a treatment change.
Talk about randomized trials and a blinded trial.
So a randomized trial is what we use to describe where we're comparing like two or more treatments, so two or more treatment arms. And basically when something is randomized, your treatment is chosen by chance. Okay. So like flipping a coin. So that's basically nobody has any say in what treatment you're going to receive. It's just totally by chance. Blinded is a study where we potentially the physician, the nurse, and the patient usually have no idea whether the patient is getting the active drug or not. And the reason why we do blinded trials is to really eliminate bias and,
Right. We had another question. Are there significant risks or discomforts to participating in a clinical trial?
The risk and discomforts are outlined in the informed consent. If there are any additional, like Judy and I have said, standard treatment, it's probably little to no more risk than standard treatment, except for when you add another drug into the scenario, and there may be some added risk from that additional drug. But as far as discomforts, that goes over, you may have to have an extra blood draw at this point where you normally wouldn't, and so you'll have a needle stick discomfort from a needle stick, so forth. But it's really not anything overwhelming for patients.
One of the risks is that the treatment doesn't work.
Right.
And that's one thing that patients are concerned about.
Yeah.
It's taking the time to be in this clinical trial and then the treatment doesn't work for them.
So let's say somebody is, they're interested in a clinical trial. Seems like it would be a little overwhelming because you hear of a lot of these clinical trials going on. Is there, once I thought I heard there was a website or something. Is there anything that narrows it down to this area that you're living in and helps you find clinical trials, maybe at your hospital or just in your city?
So there is NIH, the National Institute of Health, has a website called clinicaltrials.gov. And people can go in there and search clinical trials using just keywords. You can put in your disease, you can put in certain things, a certain drug that you're interested in, maybe even a certain area. And then you can also visit, GBMC has a website where we list our clinical trials, and most institutions do. There is also a website called Trial Check, and people can look for that. For trials on those sites.
Now we got a question about the other side of things. How does one become a clinical trial nurse?
Well, you have to go to school to become a nurse.
There's a process.
It's a process. You become an RN, probably preferably, your bachelor's degree. And then just really specializing in an area. There's not only are there research nurses in oncology, there's research nurses in many different areas, cardiology, neurology, orthopedics. And there are certifications. We have certifications that we, through research organizations, to become specialized, because there's a lot, besides caring for the patient, there's a lot of regulatory information you have to follow. There's, just
Right.
a lot of other factors that play in.
Yeah. If somebody is watching this and has maybe a family member who they've talked about possibly doing a clinical trial, what is a piece of advice that you could give them, just kind of the first step?
I think what I would tell them is, kind of do your homework a little bit. Go on one of these websites, clinicaltrials.gov. Do a little searching before you come to your physician, and then come into your physician meeting asking about clinical trials, because then that way, if your physician doesn't bring it up, then it forces him to kind of talk to you about the research that's out there and what's happened in the past.
And if there was a specific clinical trial that they were interested in, I think the first thing that they may want to do is ask for a copy of the informed consent, because that will describe the study to them. And like Judy said before, they can take it to their primary care doctor, talk to friends, family about it, and get input from other people in their lives.
Yeah, before we go, in case people have just tuned in, just want to go back over some of the big questions that people, the more common questions that people have. And when we spoke earlier, you said really about the safety of it, how safe, and then also, does my insurance cover this? So I just want to touch again on those questions. So as far as insurance goes, seems like insurance does a pretty good job at covering what's needed in the clinical trials, right?
Absolutely. They'll cover everything that is standard of care, and then those things that are not standard of care, then they would be provided by the clinical trial. And as far as safety, these clinical trials are looked at a national level as well as a local level. And as Pam mentioned earlier, we have an institutional review board at GBMC. The National Cancer Institute has an institutional review board that reviews these protocols, and those boards are made up of physicians, nurses, lay members, and they're really looking at it to see the safety of the patient. Is it ethical, and is it safe? And if it was not, we wouldn't be offering it to our patients.
And if any time during a study, if a patient, if it's seen in the trial that it's not safe, or there's a side effect, that a newly reported side effect that was pretty substantial, they would close it down. I mean, the patients would be kept informed, but we have not seen in our practice in years that that they've shut down one of our trials for safety issues.
It sounds like this is something, you would even recommend to your own family and friends if they were in the situation.
Oh, absolutely. That would be the first thing I'd
really
recommend they do.
And you said people are helping science here.
Yeah, and you get access to drugs.
Sometimes years before anybody else. I mean, that's a benefit, that you have access to new drugs before many people even get to hear about it on the news.
Before we go, speaking of that, how long from the time that they do the clinical trials do you see these drugs come out?
It's a very lengthy process, and it depends on the drug and how well it's doing in the research. Some take 5 to 10 years.
Wow.
We had one case where it was a treatment for CLL, and it's a type of leukemia, and this drug was so effective, they closed the study down with all these patients on it, and they gave everyone the drug, and it got approved so quickly, because it was so superior to what they had out there for a treatment option.
Well, it's a really interesting topic. If people have questions, I know you can continue to write them on Facebook Live, and someone from GBMC will try to answer all your questions. So Pam, Judy, thank you so much for being here. It's certainly interesting. And thank you for all that you do. Nurses are special people, so thank you.
Thank you.
And thanks for watching. We'll see you on Good Morning Maryland tomorrow at 4:30. Have a great day, and thanks again for watching us here at Facebook Live.